from problems here at home to big problems further afield. We're going to the Middle East now. There's been an escalation in clashes in Jerusalem. In the latest incident, in fact, this came through just an hour or so ago, Hamas has fired rockets at Israel from the Gaza Strip. This after warning the Jewish state to pull its security forces from the violence-torn Al-Aqsa Mosque compound. Now, before that rocket attack, the violent clashes around the mosque left at least 270 Palestinians and 12 Israeli soldiers wounded. 4 people have died in recent days in sporadic attacks on the West Bank as well. Well, let's discuss this now with Middle East journalist Paula Slier, who joins us from Jerusalem. Paula, thank you so much for coming through to us. Always fantastic to talk to you. What can you tell us about the news that we're just getting about this Hamas rocket attack on Jerusalem?
Well, just over an hour and a half ago at 6 o'clock local time, an ultimatum that Hamas gave to the Israeli authorities expired. Hamas, of course, being the Palestinian group that dominates and controls the Gaza Strip, said that if Israeli security forces do not move out of this area, although it's quiet right now, it has been the scene of violence over the past 4 days and is probably going to flare up later tonight. I'm not far from the Damascus gate, which leads to the Al-Aqsa Mosque. So Hamas said if security forces are not out of this area, it is going to send a strong message. And at precisely 6 o'clock local time, when that ultimatum came up, we heard sirens over Jerusalem. This is quite unusual. You don't usually hear sirens in Jerusalem. Rockets, so several rockets were fired from Gaza. From where we were standing here, we heard a number of explosions. I think it was the Iron Dome intercepting those rockets. As of yet, there have been no reports of damage or injuries, but we have heard that Israel has carried out airstrikes, and we are hearing from the Palestinian Health Ministry in Gaza that a number of people have been killed in those Israeli strikes, including children. I can't give you exact numbers at this stage. Here in Israel, the Israeli parliament disbanded and was evacuated immediately. There was a march taking place through Jerusalem by predominantly right-wing Israeli nationalists. It's an annual march commemorating the annexation, or when Israel reunited, the reunification, if you like, of Jerusalem after the 1967 war, when Israel took East Jerusalem, which is where I am, Arab Jerusalem, from the Jordanians. And that was a provocation. It's added to the clashes. Today is the 4th day of violence that we are witnessing here.
All right, so Paula, give us some context. We have seen, as you say, days of clashes, and there were clashes at Al-Aqsa Mosque again, and now this Hamas rocket attack, which you say is at the Iron Dome that stopped it, but then a reprisal attack. So does this represent a marked escalation, something that we haven't seen for a long time?
It's certainly something we haven't seen for a long time. The last time there was violence like this was at least 4 years ago. And the question on everyone's mind right now is whether or not it's going to flare up. The Israeli army has sent reinforcements to other areas in the West Bank. Yesterday, for example, we saw a demonstration in the Israeli northern town of Haifa. At the same time, border police and soldiers have arrived here in the Old City since Friday. And there's been this constant forward and back with Palestinians coming to pray, because of course we're in the holy month of Ramadan, and then ultimately mostly youngsters after the prayers starting to throw bottles and glass and rocks at the soldiers, who've been responding quite forcefully with with rubber bullets and stun grenades. Just to give you a sense of why this is happening, firstly, Ramadan is a sensitive time, and at the start of Ramadan, the Israeli forces moved barricades into the area, and people protested against that. The Palestinians are very clear that they don't want any Israeli presence in the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound where they go and pray. At the same time, there was a call from Hamas for people to come out onto the streets and protest. Just a short time ago, the Palestinian president, Mahmoud Abbas, postponed indefinitely Palestinian elections that were supposed to happen later this month. He blamed the Israelis for not allowing Israeli Arabs who live in East Jerusalem to vote. So all of those factors together has seen an escalation. And as I mentioned, the big question on everyone's mind is whether when Ramadan finishes in 2 days' time, we will see the violence peter out, or whether it is something that could lead to a much bigger scenario.
So, Paula, I'm sure you're keeping an eye on the casualties. Have you been able to get a sense of, I know there were clashes again today at the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which of course is important to Muslims and Jews. all told, what are we looking at in terms of casualties and the death toll?
The latest figures I have for you are from this morning's clashes, as you correctly say. They happened in the early hours of the morning, not far from where I am, at the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound. And there we saw something like 300 Palestinians injured. Several of them were hospitalized, and some 16 Israeli cops, police, injured, and one of them has been hospitalized. That's just from today. We have heard from UNICEF that in the last 3 days of violence, 43 Palestinian children have been injured. And as I mentioned to you, news coming in the last few minutes is that in the Israeli retaliatory strikes on Gaza, after Hamas fired rockets at Israel about an hour and a half ago, there are reports of deaths, including children, but we have no confirmation of that and we have no numbers. In the last week, there has also unfortunately been an Israeli kid who was killed and a Palestinian kid who was killed. So the violence is really escalating on both sides. There has been international condemnation. The United Nations Security Council has been meeting behind closed doors. There's been a lot of calls against Israel to de-escalate. For example, Amnesty International issued a statement in which it says it has its own people on the ground and the Israelis are using, to quote, excessive force. Of course, we are receiving these signs that the violence is spreading, particularly now with the rocket attacks coming in from Gaza, and also demonstrations and protests happening at several localities across the West Bank. So it is likely that the violence will continue at least until the end of Ramadan. What remains to be seen is what happens afterwards.
All right. Well, thank you so much for bringing us that update from Jerusalem. Thank you very much, Paula Slier there.